front of the board, and a lot of the times it's just speaking the language they need to speak because they only have a finite time to consider cybersecurity, understanding what's important to them. And every company and every board member is different, of course, but I've tried to take a pretty big sample set that I'll be quoting throughout this presentation to kind of share various ideas and what do they care about, how do they want to hear it, what type of evidence do they actually require, etc. So let's jump right in. A little background about myself. Again, Brian Contos. I work with Mandiant. But I've been in cybersecurity for about 25 years. I've worked in over 50 countries, started with DISA and then Bell Labs, then started building a whole bunch of startups, Riptech, ArcSight, Imperva, Cylance, and a bunch of others. I've written a couple books, and I was in a cyber warfare documentary recently as well. So today's agenda, again, I'm going to try to keep this as fun and interesting as possible. I don't want to be this is a very serious subject, of course, but I kind of want to, interject some fun and some history and some other bits that I think paint a more interesting picture than just sharing a bunch of quotes with you. So a little bit of history, some conversations with board members, of course. We're going to have a bunch of quotes throughout, some business relevance, hot topics. What do they care about in terms of cyber? What's sort of on the tip of their tongue in terms of discussion points, and then demonstrating operational competency. So, and the first quote here I have is from a mentor of mine, Art Coviello, and Art was the former president and CEO with RSA Security, and today he sits on the board of a publicly traded financial services company, multiple tech companies, multiple security companies, just a huge wealth of knowledge in this space. And I'll be quoting him a couple times throughout this presentation. But this first one, and I'm just going to read these quotes out so you guys don't need to read everything. But while board members don't need to be cybersecurity experts, they do need to be able to interpret risk metrics regarding cybersecurity, just like they do when understanding sales or operations or finance. Only when there is an understanding of risk can boards provide the most appropriate oversight and governance. I think it's a very simple quote, but it's really important because he's basically putting cybersecurity up there at the same level of sales and operation and finance, things that are considered very strategic to the organization. And each one of those has a level of risk. Some of that risk might be cyber, actually, but a lot of it's probably not. And the fact that when they're looking at risk, cyber is just one flavor of multiple things that they need to be able to consider. And ultimately, they're helping guide the organization. So they need to understand what the risks are so they can provide the best oversight and the best governance. If they have limited exposure to sales, to operations, to finance, they're not going to be as effective, just like if they have limited exposure to what's happening in cyber. And there's been a shrinking threat window. So about 3000 BC was the first historical reference that the sea was actually used for trade, for commerce. So the commercialization, if you will, of the sea. The first recorded pirates weren't until about 1300 BC, right? So it took a couple thousand years before somebody said, hey, that boat going between here and that island, why don't we just rob it, right? So that's a pretty big threat window. We don't see threat windows like that today. So first commercialization of the sea, pretty broad threat window. Then air. The first commercialization of air was in 1859. John Wise had a hot air balloon. It was used to deliver mail. It crashed and failed miserably. Literally, it crashed. It didn't work, but it was a good idea at its core. But we saw that commercialization of the air, while it started in 1859, the first hijacking didn't happen until 1931, and that was actually in Peru. So the threat window is shrinking, but from our standards today, still pretty big. Then in 1962, we had the first commercial satellite, Telstar, just a couple years after Sputnik, and this was used by AT&T for television broadcasting. We haven't honestly seen that much happen in terms of space and satellite warfare. It's been a discussion topic for sure. There have been some command and control systems and bots. The Trilla data theft happened in 2015, so it has been tapped into. But because of access and other limitations, it hasn't been exploited, at least by criminal attackers, the way that we would think of more terrestrial attacks happening. And then in 1990 or 1988 rather, NSFNet and MCI Mail said, hey, you've got email users, we've got email users. Why don't we charge them so they can email each other? Commercialization of the internet, right? And pretty much as soon as that happened, we had things like the Morris worm and other attacks. So the threat window kind of went from thousands of years